In the quiet corners of Cleveland County, North Carolina, where the rolling hills of the Piedmont begin to whisper to the mountains, there is a silence that feels heavier than elsewhere. It is a town called Shelby, a place where the Sunday morning air is thick with the scent of pine and the sound of church bells, where neighbors are not just faces, but extensions of one's own family. In the year 2000, Shelby was the kind of sanctuary where doors were rarely locked and the darkness of the outside world felt like a distant, flickering television screen. But on the morning of February 14th, a day meant for love and warmth, that sanctuary was irrevocably shattered. A 9-year-old girl named Asha Degree, a child often described as the sun around which her family orbited, walked out of her home and into a freezing rainstorm, never to be seen again. To understand the magnitude of this loss, one must first understand the girl who was left behind in the headlines. Asha was not a child of rebellion. She was a shy, studious fourth grader who excelled at basketball and took pride in her church activities. She was the kind of daughter who followed the rules, not out of fear, but out of a deep, innate sense of love for her parents, Harold and Aquila. The Degree household was built on a foundation of discipline and affection. On that Sunday evening, the family had shared a quiet meal, the children had finished their homework, and the rhythm of a normal life was humming along its usual tracks. There was a power outage earlier that night due to a storm, a detail that added a layer of unease to the atmosphere, but by 2:30 in the morning, when Harold checked on his children for the last time, everything seemed perfect. Asha and her older brother, O'Brien, were asleep in their shared room. The house was still. The world was at rest. Yet, somewhere in the narrow window between that final check and the break of dawn, something shifted. A 9-year-old girl who was known to be terrified of storms, a child who would hide under the covers at the first rumble of thunder, allegedly packed a backpack and stepped out into a night of torrential rain and howling winds. She left behind the safety of her bed, the warmth of her brother's presence, and the absolute security of her parents' love. She walked down a long driveway and began a journey along Highway 18, a dark and winding road that offered no comfort to a solitary child. This is the point where the story of Asha Degree stops being a domestic memory and starts becoming a national tragedy. It is the moment where the why begins to haunt every person who has ever heard her name. The culture of a small southern town like Shelby is one of collective responsibility. When the news broke at 6:30 that morning, after Aquila went to wake her children for school and found only an empty bed, the community didn't just watch, they felt the blow. The panic that set in was visceral. Within hours, the local police, the FBI, and hundreds of volunteers were scouring the woods and the ditches along the highway. They were looking for a girl in white sneakers and white jeans, a small figure lost in a landscape that had suddenly turned hostile. The image of Aquila Degree standing in her yard, calling her daughter's name into the wind, is a haunting tableau of maternal agony that remains etched in the memory of the town. It was Valentine's Day, but there were no celebrations in Shelby. There was only the sound of search dogs and the sight of rain-soaked posters bearing the face of a smiling girl with pigtails. As the investigation took its first tentative steps, a chilling piece of information emerged. 2 different motorists reported seeing a small female figure walking along the highway around 4 o'clock in the morning. One driver was so concerned that he turned his truck around, circling back to see if the child needed help. He told investigators that when he approached, the girl didn't wave him down or ask for a ride. Instead, she became startled and ran into the darkness of the woods. It was a detail that confused and terrified the investigators. Why would she run away from help? Was she coached by someone she trusted? Or was her fear of the unknown so great that even a stranger's kindness felt like a threat? These questions remain the jagged edges of a mystery that has refused to heal for over 25 years. The psychological weight of this disappearance on the Degree family is almost impossible to measure. For Harold and Aquila, the passing years have not brought closure, only a more refined version of pain. They have kept Asha's room exactly as it was, a shrine to a life that was interrupted but never forgotten. Every year, they lead a march along the highway where she was last seen, a solemn procession of hope and remembrance. This is the human cost of a cold case, the way time stretches out like a desert, with no oasis of truth in sight. In Shelby, Asha is not just a missing person, she is the Shelby sweetheart, a symbol of a lost innocence that the town has never truly reclaimed. The collective empathy of the community has sustained the search, but it has also served as a constant reminder that evil can penetrate even the most guarded borders of a family's life. As we look back at those first few days, the lack of physical evidence is staggering. No footprints were found in the mud, no scraps of clothing were caught on the briars of the forest, and no scent was picked up by the bloodhounds. It was as if Asha had simply evaporated into the mist. The investigation was forced to rely on the thin threads of witness testimony and the agonizingly slow process of elimination. The local authorities were faced with a paradox: a child who was too young to plan an escape, too fearful to brave a storm alone, and too loved to have a reason to leave. The initial search covered miles of rugged terrain, but the more they looked, the more it felt like they were chasing a ghost. The silence of the woods seemed to mock their efforts, holding onto its secrets with a cold, indifferent grip. This is the beginning of a narrative that spans decades, a story that would eventually be revitalized by the cold, precise tools of modern science. But in those early weeks of February 2000, there was no DNA profiling, no cell phone pings, and no digital footprints to follow. There was only a mother's intuition, a father's grief, and the growing realization that the girl who walked into the rain might never walk back out. The community of Shelby was forced to confront a terrifying reality, that among them, perhaps hidden in plain sight, was a darkness that had reached out and claimed one of their own. The investigation would soon move from the muddy banks of Highway 18 to the far reaches of the state, but the heart of the mystery would always remain centered on that empty bed in the Degree home. The American South is often defined by its traditions and its long memories, and the disappearance of Asha Degree became a part of that cultural fabric. It changed the way parents in Shelby watched their children at play, it changed the way people looked at the passing cars on the highway. The collective trauma of her loss became a shared burden, a wound that reopened every time a new lead fizzled out or a milestone birthday passed without her. The empathy felt for the Degrees was not just a polite gesture, it was a profound, shared sorrow for a family whose lives had been divided into before and after. The before was a world of school projects and basketball games, the after was a world of press conferences and unanswered prayers. In this first chapter of her story, we are left with the image of a 9-year-old girl standing on the edge of a road, caught between the life she knew and a destiny she didn't choose. The rain is falling, the wind is biting, and the shadows of the North Carolina woods are deep. As we move forward into the investigation, we must carry this image with us, not as a statistic, but as a human being whose life mattered. The search for Asha Degree is more than just a quest for justice, it is a testament to the enduring power of a family's love and the relentless pursuit of the truth, no matter how long it takes to find it. The road ahead is long, filled with false leads and shocking revelations, but it begins here, in the cold, wet dawn of a Valentine's Day that changed everything. As the grey light of that first morning began to push back the shadows of Valentine's Day, the town of Shelby woke up to a reality that felt more like a fever dream than a waking life. The rain continued to fall, cold and relentless, as if nature itself were trying to wash away the traces of a tragedy it had just witnessed. In the living room of the Degree home, the silence was no longer peaceful, it was a physical weight, a suffocating reminder of the small, vibrant soul that was no longer there to fill the space. For Aquila and Harold, the transition from the before to the after happened in the span of a single heartbeat, the moment they realized their daughter's bed was cold. It is a moment every parent fears, a primal terror that transcends culture and time, but in the close-knit fabric of North Carolina, it felt like a betrayal of the very earth they stood upon. The investigation quickly centered on the stretch of Highway 18 where the sightings had occurred, a road that cut through the heart of the community like a dark ribbon. The two truck drivers who had seen Asha were haunted by the image of her, a tiny, solitary figure battling the elements. One of them, a man who spent his life navigating the lonely stretches of the American interstate, spoke of the profound wrongness of the sight. He didn't see a runaway, he saw a lamb in the mouth of a storm. When he tried to intervene, when he turned his massive rig around to offer a sanctuary of warmth and safety, the girl's reaction was not one of relief, but of sheer, unadulterated flight. She vanished into the tree line, leaving him with nothing but the sound of his idling engine and the rhythmic thumping of his windshield wipers. That image of Asha running away from help remains one of the most agonizing puzzles of the case, suggesting a level of fear or a sense of mission that a 9-year-old should never have to carry. In the South, the woods are more than just trees, they are a labyrinth of memory and mystery, and for the people of Shelby, they suddenly became a place of menace. Hundreds of volunteers, men and women who had tucked their own children into bed just hours before, now stood shoulder to shoulder in the mud. They moved in long, somber lines through the brush, their voices hoarse from calling her name. There is a specific kind of communal grief that takes hold in these moments, a shared understanding that if one child is not safe, no child is. They looked for a white t-shirt, a pair of sneakers, anything that would link the living girl to the silent forest. But the woods gave up nothing. No broken twigs, no footprints in the red clay, no discarded ribbon. It was as if the rain had not just soaked the earth, but had acted as a shroud, erasing the physical existence of Asha Degree from the world. As the days turned into weeks, the psychological toll on the family began to manifest in a quiet, stoic desperation. Harold and Aquila did not retreat into their grief, they turned it into a weapon of persistence. They spoke to the media with a dignity that broke the hearts of everyone watching, their eyes reflecting a fatigue that sleep could not touch. The culture of Shelby, built on faith and the belief that the truth will set you free, was being tested to its absolute limit. People began to look at their neighbors differently, not with malice, but with a nagging, terrifying curiosity. Who was on the road that night? Who knew the rhythm of the Degree household? The illusion of small-town safety had been replaced by a vigilant, suspicious silence. The sweetheart of Shelby had become a ghost, and the town was now haunted by its own inability to protect her. The logic of the investigation began to shift from a search for a lost child to a deep dive into the unknown. The FBI brought in profilers, men who lived in the dark corners of the human mind, trying to understand what could compel a child to leave her home in such extreme conditions. They looked at her backpack, her interests, her school life, searching for a trigger, a reason why the safety of her bedroom would suddenly feel less secure than the middle of a storm. Was there someone in her life, a figure of authority or a trusted friend, who had planted a seed of necessity in her mind? In the absence of physical evidence, the authorities had to rely on the invisible, the whispers of the community, the secrets held behind closed doors, and the psychological footprints that a predator leaves behind. This period of the case was defined by a series of false dawns. A tip would come in about a girl seen at a rest stop, or a piece of clothing found in a ditch, and for a few hours, the town would hold its breath. But one by one, the leads withered away. The frustration of the local police was palpable, they were working against a clock that was ticking toward the unthinkable. Every sunset that passed without a trace of Asha was a victory for the darkness. The case was no longer just about a disappearance, it was about the resilience of a family that refused to let the world forget. Aquila's voice, steady but trembling with the weight of her love, became the conscience of the investigation. She wasn't just asking for her daughter back, she was demanding that the universe account for the hole left in her heart. The bond between the family and the community grew into something sacred. The annual walks began, a tradition born of pain but sustained by hope. They would walk the path she took, their shoes clicking on the asphalt of Highway 18, a living monument to a girl who never made it to her destination. It was a way of reclaiming the road, of saying that the darkness might have taken her, but it would not take their memory of her. The cultural identity of Shelby became inextricably linked to Asha's face, her pigtails and her bright smile serving as a reminder of the fragility of the things we hold most dear. As we move closer to the shocking discoveries that would come years later, we must understand the foundation of this search. It was never just about a crime, it was about a promise made to a child that her name would always be spoken. As the first year drew to a close, the investigation felt like it was spinning its wheels in the mud of that fateful February night. The national spotlight began to dim, as it always does, moving on to the next tragedy, the next headline. But in Shelby, the fire did not go out. It smoldered in the hearts of the detectives who kept her file on their desks, and it burned in the quiet prayers of the townspeople. They were waiting for a sign, a crack in the silence, something that would prove that the earth had not simply swallowed her whole. They did not know then that the answer was waiting just 30 miles away, buried in the dark soil of a neighboring county, encased in black plastic and waiting for the moment when the truth could no longer be contained. The silence was about to be broken, but the sound it would make would be more haunting than anyone could have imagined. The passage of time in a missing persons case is not a healer, it is a slow and persistent erosion of the soul. For 18 months, the town of Shelby lived in a state of suspended animation, a community held captive by the memory of a little girl who simply walked into a storm. The posters of Asha Degree, once vibrant and hopeful, began to fade under the relentless Carolina sun, their edges curling like the brittle hopes of the investigators. But in August 2001, the silence was shattered not by a sighting or a phone call, but by the physical weight of the earth giving up a secret. 30 miles north of Shelby, in the rugged terrain of Burke County, a construction worker noticed something out of place near the edge of a ravine along Highway 18. It was a package, double-wrapped in black plastic trash bags, buried beneath the red clay and the rot of fallen leaves. When the authorities carefully peeled back those layers, they didn't just find a backpack, they found the first tangible evidence of a nightmare that had been hidden in plain sight. Inside that bag, protected from the elements by its plastic tomb, was the primary school identity of Asha Degree. There was her name, written in the neat, careful hand of a child, staring back at the detectives from the darkness. But as they inventoried the contents, the professional composure of the crime scene technicians began to fray. Alongside Asha's personal belongings were items that felt like static on a clear radio frequency, things that didn't belong to her, yet were inextricably linked to her final moments. There was a book by Dr. Seuss, McElligot's Pool, a whimsical tale about a boy imagining fantastic creatures in a small pond, borrowed from her school library but never returned. And then there was the most chilling discovery, a New Kids on the Block concert t-shirt. This was not the clothing of a 9-year-old girl from a conservative, religious home in the year 2000. It was an artifact from a different era, a piece of clothing that Asha's parents had never seen and certainly had never bought for her. The presence of these items changed the heartbeat of the investigation. It was no longer just a search for a runaway, it was a confrontation with a predator's trophy room. In the psychology of criminal profiling, the act of burying a victim's belongings in a remote location is a deliberate, ritualistic behavior. It suggested that whoever had taken Asha hadn't just acted on impulse, they had taken the time to package her memory, to conceal it in a place where they thought it would never be found. The red clay of North Carolina is notoriously difficult to dig, yet someone had labored in the shadows to ensure that Asha's backpack remained a secret. This discovery brought a wave of fresh agony to Harold and Aquila. They were forced to look at that t-shirt and that book and wonder, who gave these to her? Was this the law that drew her out of her bed? The image of a shy, rule-following girl being manipulated by a stranger's gifts is a horror that no parent should ever have to visualize, yet it became the central theme of their waking hours. The culture of the South is rooted in the soil, and in Burke County, that soil had become a witness. The discovery site was near a bridge, a place of transit, suggesting that the person responsible was familiar with the backroads and the quiet corners of the Piedmont. The FBI sent the backpack to the elite labs at Quantico, hoping that the fibers and the dust trapped within the plastic would speak. They looked for hair, for skin cells, for the microscopic signatures of a killer. But in 2001, the technology was still a blunt instrument compared to the precision of today. The results were inconclusive, leaving the family and the town in a state of agonizing limbo. They had her bag, they had her name, but they still did not have her. The backpack was a fragment of a life, a hollow shell that served only to amplify the emptiness of her bedroom back in Shelby. During this period, the human element of the story became a testament to the endurance of the maternal spirit. Asha Degree refused to let the discovery of the bag be the end of the story. She became a fixture on local television, her voice a steady drumbeat of demand for justice. She didn't just speak for Asha, and she spoke for every mother who has ever felt the world turn cold. The annual walks continued, but now they felt more like a pilgrimage. The community would gather at the spot, edges curling like the brittle hopes of the investigators. But in August 2001, the silence was shattered not by a sighting or a phone call, but by the physical weight of the earth giving up a secret. 30 miles north of Shelby, in the rugged terrain of Burke County, a construction worker noticed something out of place near the edge of a ravine along Highway 18. It was a package, double-wrapped in black plastic trash bags, buried beneath the red clay and the rot of fallen leaves. When the authorities carefully peeled back those layers, they didn't just find a backpack, they found the first tangible evidence of a nightmare that had been hidden in plain sight. Inside that bag, protected from the elements by its plastic tomb, was the primary school identity of Asha Degree. There was her name, written in the neat, careful hand of a child, staring back at the detectives from the darkness. But as they inventoried the contents, the professional composure of the crime scene technicians began to fray. Alongside Asha's personal belongings were items that felt like static on a clear radio frequency, things that didn't belong to her, yet were inextricably linked to her final moments. There was a book by Dr. Seuss, McElligot's Pool, a whimsical tale about a boy imagining fantastic creatures in a small pond, borrowed from her school library but never returned. And then there was the most chilling discovery, a New Kids on the Block concert t-shirt. This was not the clothing of a 9-year-old girl from a conservative, religious home in the year 2000. It was an artifact from a different era, a piece of clothing that Asha's parents had never seen and certainly had never bought for her. The presence of these items changed the heartbeat of the investigation. It was no longer just a search for a runaway, it was a confrontation with a predator's trophy room. In the psychology of criminal profiling, the act of burying a victim's belongings in a remote location is a deliberate, ritualistic behavior. It suggested that whoever had taken Asha hadn't just acted on impulse, they had taken the time to package her memory, to conceal it in a place where they thought it would never be found. The red clay of North Carolina is notoriously difficult to dig, yet someone had labored in the shadows to ensure that Asha's backpack remained a secret. This discovery brought a wave of fresh agony to Harold and Aquila. They were forced to look at that t-shirt and that book and wonder, who gave these to her? Was this the law that drew her out of her bed? The image of a shy, rule-following girl being manipulated by a stranger's gifts is a horror that no parent should ever have to visualize, yet it became the central theme of their waking hours. The culture of the South is rooted in the soil, and in Burt County, that soil had become a witness. The discovery site was near a bridge, a place of transit, suggesting that the person responsible was familiar with the backroads and the quiet corners of the Piedmont. The FBI sent the backpack to the elite labs at Quantico, hoping that the fibers and the dust trapped within the plastic would speak. They looked for hair, for skin cells, for the microscopic signatures of a killer. But in 2001, the technology was still a blunt instrument compared to the precision of today. The results were inconclusive, leaving the family and the town in a state of agonizing limbo. They had her bag, they had her name, but they still did not have her. The backpack was a fragment of a life, a hollow shell that served only to amplify the emptiness of her bedroom back in Shelby. During this period, the human element of the story became a testament to the endurance of the maternal spirit. Asha Degree refused to let the discovery of the bag be the end of the story. She became a fixture on local television, her voice a steady drumbeat of demand for justice. She didn't just speak for Asha, and she spoke for every mother who has ever felt the world turn cold. The annual walks continued, but now they felt more like a pilgrimage. The community would gather at the spot. Landscape, and the annual walks on Highway 18 had turned into a generational ritual of grief. But as the world moved deeper into the 21st century, the tools of justice began to evolve in ways that felt like something out of a science fiction novel. The dawn of the 2020s brought with it a revolution in forensic science, specifically in the field of investigative genetic genealogy. This was no longer just about matching a suspect's blood to a crime scene, it was about reading the invisible ink of ancestry, using the vast databases of human heritage to track down a killer through the DNA of their own distant relatives. In the quiet halls of the FBI's Quantico laboratory, the backpack that had been recovered from that dark ravine in 2001 was being reopened, not just as a piece of history, but as a living witness. The breakthrough did not come with a thunderclap, but with the patient, methodical unweaving of a single strand of hair. Found on the New Kids on the Block t-shirt, the very item that had haunted the Degree family's dreams for years, was a microscopic sample of DNA that didn't belong to Asha. For years, this sample had been a dead end, a whisper that no one could translate. But in 2024, the whispers finally became a name. The DNA was linked to a woman named Annalie Dedman Ramirez, who had been only 13 years old when Asha vanished, and to a man named Russell Underhill, a figure whose life had drifted through the shadows of the community before ending in 2004. This was the moment the ground beneath Shelby began to shift. The names weren't those of high-profile criminals or outsiders passing through, they belonged to people who were part of the local fabric, families who had lived, worked, and prayed in the same counties where Asha's face looked out from every store window. The human element of this discovery was staggering. Imagine being a member of the Degree family, having held onto a fragile hope for 24 years, only to be told that the key to your daughter's disappearance might have been held by a teenage girl and a local man just a few miles away. The empathy of the investigators was palpable as they prepared to execute a series of massive search warrants in September 2024. This was not just a cold case anymore, it was a race against time and a confrontation with a living, breathing secret. The culture of the American South is one of deep-seated family loyalty, but it is also one of immense moral weight. As FBI agents and local deputies descended on properties owned by the Dedman family, the town of Shelby watched with bated breath. They saw the black SUVs, the forensic tents, and the excavators tearing into the earth. It was a visual representation of the truth being dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light of day. Among the items seized during these raids was a relic from the past that sent a shiver through the community, a green 1970s AMC Rambler. For years, the FBI had been searching for a car of that specific era and color, based on early witness reports of a vehicle seen near the spot where Asha vanished. Seeing that car being towed away on a flatbed truck was a moment of profound, heavy clarity. It was a physical link between the muddy highway of 2000 and the high-tech investigation of 2024. But beyond the machines and the DNA, the heart of the story remained the people. The investigators were now looking at the Dedman family, Roy, Connie, and their daughters, not just as neighbors, but as individuals who might have carried the weight of a child's fate for a quarter of a century. The psychological pressure of such a secret is a poison that seeps into everything, and the authorities were betting that after 24 years, the cracks were finally starting to show. In this era of digital footprints, the investigation took a turn into the clouds, specifically, the iCloud accounts and text messages of the Dedman daughters. What they found was a haunting dialogue of fear, anxiety, and a desperate struggle with the past. These weren't the cold, calculated messages of professional criminals, they were the panicked words of sisters trying to reconcile their loyalty to their father with the crushing weight of a mounting investigation. "I'm so worried," one message read. "It's a nightmare and it's just going to get worse." These snippets of conversation provided a window into a house divided by its own history. The cultural expectation of protecting one's own was clashing with the undeniable reality of a 9-year-old girl who never got to grow up. The empathy shifted momentarily to the daughters, who seemed to be drowning in a sea of family secrets they no longer knew how to keep. The role of Russell Underhill added a layer of tragedy to the complexity. A man who had lived in properties managed by the Dedmans, he had passed away long before the DNA could point a finger at him. In the eyes of the law, he was a ghost, a suspect who could no longer be questioned or held to account. This is the bitter pill of delayed justice. Sometimes the people who hold the answers leave the room before the questions can be asked. Yet, his DNA on that t-shirt was the bridge that led the police to the Dedman doorstep. It suggested a proximity, a shared space where Asha's life and the lives of these strangers had intersected in a violent, permanent way. The investigators were forced to reconstruct a world from 2000, a world of nursing homes and rural properties, searching for the moment when a little girl's path crossed with a predator's whim. As the search warrants were unsealed in early 2025, the community was forced to confront the most painful theory of all, that Asha's death might have been an accident that was covered up with calculated cruelty. The idea that a child could be struck by a car or caught in a tragic circumstance, only to be disposed of like a piece of refuse to protect the reputation of a local family, was a blow to the soul of Shelby. It challenged the very idea of what it means to be a neighbor. The empathy for the Degrees reached a new, feverish pitch. They weren't just victims of a crime, they were victims of a 24-year lie. Every time a Dedman family member denied involvement, it felt like another stone being thrown at Asha's memory. The culture of silence that had protected the suspects for so long was finally being dismantled, brick by painful brick. Yet, despite the DNA, despite the car, and despite the incriminating text messages, one piece of the puzzle remained stubbornly missing: Asha herself. The investigators dug deep into the soil of the Dedman properties, searching for a resting place, a sign that the sunflower of Shelby could finally be brought home. They found old bones that turned out to be animals, they found buried trash and forgotten relics, but they did not find her. This is the lingering trauma of the missing, the no-body case that leaves a family in a permanent state of mourning without a grave to visit. The emotional stakes of the 2024 investigation were higher than ever because for the first time, the truth was within reach, yet it remained just behind a veil of denials and legal maneuvers. The transition from the old-fashioned detective work of the early 2000s to the high-stakes genetic testing of today is a testament to the persistence of the human spirit. It shows that no matter how deep you bury a secret, the future has a way of finding it. The story of Asha Degree was no longer a cold file gathering dust, it was a living, breathing pursuit of accountability. As we move into the darker corners of the family's confessions and the legal battles that followed, we must remember the girl at the center of it all. She is no longer just the child on the poster, and she is the catalyst for a transformation in how we define justice. The science had spoken, the messages had been read, and the green car had been seized. The net was closing, and the silence of the North Carolina woods was finally being replaced by the loud, demanding voice of the truth. This chapter of the story reminds us that empathy is not just about feeling sorry for the victims, it is about the collective will of a society to say that a life cannot be erased without a trace. The cultural shift in Shelby was profound. The town that once looked away in confusion was now looking directly at the suspects with a demand for answers. The after was no longer a state of waiting, it was a state of reckoning. And as the investigation focused on a specific night in mid-February 25 years ago, the ghosts of the past were being called to the stand. The story was far from over, but the light was finally winning. The rain that had fallen on that Valentine's Day so long ago was finally starting to clear, revealing a path that led directly to the truth, no matter how many people tried to block the way. Behind the closed doors of the interrogation rooms and the sterile walls of the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, a new and devastating narrative began to take shape in early 2025. It was a story not of a monster in the woods, but of a catastrophic failure of human character within a single household. The legal documents and search warrants, unsealed like a painful confession, revealed that the investigators' focus had narrowed sharply onto the Dedmon sisters, Lizzie, Sarah, and Annalie. The theory was no longer a vague suspicion, it was a heartbreaking possibility that an ordinary family had spent 25 years living atop a secret that would have crushed anyone else. The empathy that the community had once reserved solely for the Degrees began to morph into a complex, tragic fascination with the Dedmons. How does a sisterhood, bound by blood and a shared upbringing in the quiet South, carry the weight of a missing child for their entire adult lives? The most chilling revelation came from the digital whispers captured in the sisters' private messages. For years, the world had wondered what happened to Asha on Highway 18, but in the fall of 2024, Lizzie Foster's own words provided a terrifying potential answer. In a text to her sister Sarah, Lizzie recounted a conversation with the family's attorney that felt like a punch to the gut. The theory is I did it. Accident. He hid it. Those 9 words, accident. He hid it, suggested a scenario so mundane yet so monstrous that it redefined the entire case. It proposed that the disappearance of Asha Degree wasn't a calculated abduction, but a momentary tragedy on a dark, rainy road, followed by a quarter-century of calculated silence. The he in that message was widely understood to be their father, Roy Dedmon, a man who, if the theory held, chose to protect his own blood by erasing the life of another's child. This is where the human element of the story becomes almost too heavy to bear. We are forced to imagine the internal world of a teenage girl in 2000, perhaps driving that green AMC Rambler through the storm, hearing a thud, and realizing her life had changed forever. We are forced to imagine a father, faced with his daughter's mistake, making the unthinkable choice to wrap a 9-year-old girl in black plastic and bury her in the red clay. This cultural tradition of protecting the family at all costs is a dark thread that runs through many rural communities, but here, it had reached a level of cruelty that defied logic. The empathy one might feel for a panicked teenager evaporates when confronted with the 25 years of silence that followed, the way they watched Aquila Degree cry on television year after year, the way they walked the same streets as the family they had destroyed, and the way they kept their secret while the town hailed Asha as its sweetheart. The investigation also brought to light a witness who had been holding his own secret for nearly 2 decades. A man who had once partied with the Dedmon sisters in the mid-2000s came forward with a memory that had haunted him like a ghost. He described a night where Lizzie, clouded by alcohol, and perhaps the unbearable weight of her conscience, broke down and sobbed, "I killed Asha Degree." In that moment, her sister Sarah reportedly stepped in with a cold, sharp command to "shut up," a reaction that the witness said felt like a bucket of ice water. This interaction, though excluded from courtrooms for years as hearsay, now served as the psychological backbone of the 2025 warrants. It painted a picture of a family dynamic built on a foundation of silence and enforced loyalty, where the truth was a fire that had to be stamped out every time it flickered to life. As the authorities dug into the physical history of the Dedmon properties, they weren't just looking for bones, they were looking for the intersection of two very different American lives. Russell Underhill, the man whose DNA was found on the backpack, emerged as a tragic, shadowy figure in this drama. Living in a nursing home managed by the Dedmons, he was a man with no voice of his own, a recipient of their care who may have been used as a convenient scapegoat or an unwitting accomplice in the disposal of the evidence. The fact that his DNA was on the shirt, the same shirt that Aquila Degree had never seen, suggested that the backpack hadn't been packed by Asha at all. It had been staged. It was a decoy, a piece of theater designed to lead the police away from Shelby and toward the ravine in Burke County. This realization was a new kind of violation for the Degree family. They hadn't just lost their daughter, they had been toyed with by her killers. The cultural impact of these revelations in Shelby was profound. The town was forced to look at the Dedmons, a family that had been part of their community, their schools, and their commerce, and see a mask. The empathy for the daughters, who were now mothers themselves, began to curdle into a demand for accountability. How could they tuck their own children into bed every night knowing that Asha's bed had been empty since 2000 because of them? The psychological resilience required to maintain such a lie is staggering, but as the 2025 investigation proved, even the strongest walls of silence eventually develop cracks. The text messages showed a family in a state of nervous collapse, with the sisters debating whether to follow Daddy's lead or finally speak the truth to save their own mental health. "We can't keep living like this," Sarah had messaged. It was the sound of a 25-year-old burden finally becoming too heavy to carry. In the middle of this legal and emotional storm stood Harold and Aquila Degree, their dignity unshaken but their hearts newly broken. To learn that the answer might have been so close, and so needlessly cruel, was a different kind of pain than the mystery itself. They were no longer just waiting for a missing child, they were waiting for a confession from people who had watched them suffer in silence for a generation. The logic of the investigation now moved toward the final, most difficult goal, the recovery of Asha's remains. The police used ground-penetrating radar and K-9 units trained to detect the scent of ancient death, scouring the woods and the crawlspaces of the Dedmon properties. Every hole dug was a hope and a heartbreak, a physical manifestation of the community's need to finally lay the sweetheart of Shelby to rest. This chapter of the story is defined by the tension between family loyalty and moral truth. It is a narrative about the choices we make in the dark and the way those choices eventually find their way into the light. The Dedmon sisters, once just names in a file, had become symbols of a catastrophic moral failure. Their story serves as a somber reminder that justice is not just about finding a body or making an arrest, it is about the restoration of the truth in a community that has been poisoned by a lie. As we move toward the final conclusion of this journey, we are left with the haunting image of a house built on a secret, and a family across town that never stopped kept the light on. The road from Highway 18 has led us to the very doorstep of the truth, and the silence of the North Carolina night is finally, irrevocably, about to end. The empathetic connection we feel for Asha in this moment is sharper than ever. She wasn't just a girl who went missing, she was a child who was failed by every adult who knew the truth. She was a child whose memory was manipulated to protect a reputation. But as the investigation into the Dedmons reached its fever pitch, it became clear that Asha Degree would have the last word. Her name, her face, and the small fragments of her life found in that backpack had survived longer than the secrets of those who took her. The Sunflower of Shelby was no longer just a memory, and she was a force of nature, a beacon of justice that refused to be extinguished. The final pieces of the puzzle were being fitted into place, and the picture they formed was one of a tragedy that should never have happened, and a silence that should never have been kept. The sun still rises over the rolling hills of Cleveland County, but for those who know the story of the girl in the yellow raincoat, the light feels a little thinner than it used to. 25 years have passed since Asha Degree stepped out into the rain, and while the world has moved on to new headlines and different tragedies, the people of Shelby remain anchored to that one frozen moment in February 2000. The case has now entered its final, most painful act, a reckoning that is as much about the endurance of a family's love as it is about the cold, hard facts of a criminal investigation. As the legal battles against the Dedmon family continue to unfold in the courtrooms of North Carolina, the community is left to grapple with a truth that is far more disturbing than any ghost story. The monster wasn't a stranger hiding in the woods, it was the silence of a neighbor, the calculated loyalty of a family that chose its own survival over the life of a 9-year-old child. The emotional core of this final chapter is the image of Harold and Aquila Degree, now older, their hair silvered by the stress of a quarter-century of waiting. They have become the living conscience of Shelby, a testament to the fact that grief does not have an expiration date. When the news of the DNA matches and the raids on the Dedmon properties broke, the world expected a sense of triumph, a moment of closure. But for the Degrees, there is no such thing as closure without Asha. There is only a different kind of waiting. They now stand on the precipice of the ultimate truth, knowing that the people who may have taken their daughter's life have been walking the same streets and breathing the same air as them for decades. The empathy felt for this couple is no longer just about their loss, it is about their incredible, superhuman resilience in the face of a betrayal that defies description. In the South, there is a profound sense of place, a belief that the land remembers what the people try to forget. The search for Asha's remains has become a sacred mission for the investigators, a way of purifying the soil that was used to hide a crime. Every time an excavator bites into the red clay of a Dedmon field, or a dive team enters a local pond, the town holds its collective breath. They are looking for a small frame, perhaps still wearing the remnants of a white t-shirt, a child who has been denied a proper resting place for longer than she was ever alive. This is the final dead ode to Asha Degree, to bring her back from the dark ravine, the plastic bags, and the hidden holes, and to place her in a spot where the sun can reach her. The cultural importance of a funeral, of a name on a headstone, is a pillar of life in North Carolina, and until Asha has that, the case will always feel like an open wound. The legal maneuvers of 2025 have revealed a family in a state of moral decay. The Dedmon sisters, once bound by a secret they thought would protect them, are now facing the reality that the truth is a relentless hunter. Their denials, their talk of daddy's lead, and their attempts to distance themselves from the accident on the road have created a portrait of a family that lost its soul long before the police arrived. The tragedy of the Dedmons is a cautionary tale about the high cost of a lie. It shows how one moment of panic followed by 25 years of concealment can destroy multiple generations, leaving a legacy of shame that no lawyer can erase. The community of Shelby, which once prided itself on its quiet safety, must now confront the fact that such a secret could survive in its midst, hidden behind the facade of ordinary lives. As we look toward the future, the questions that remain are the ones that keep the detectives awake at night. Where exactly is she? Who was the last person to look into her eyes? And why, after all the search parties and the prayers, did it take the microscopic power of DNA to break the wall of silence? These open questions are the jagged edges of a story that refuses to be neatly filed away. The mystery of why Asha left her house that night, the trigger that drew a shy girl into a storm, may never be fully understood unless someone finally chooses truth over loyalty. but perhaps the why is no longer the most important part. Perhaps the most important part is the who, the recognition of Asha as a human being whose life was not a footnote, but a story that demanded to be told. The legacy of Asha Degree has changed the landscape of American childhood. Her face was one of the first to be featured in the runaway train era of missing person awareness, and her case has become a textbook example of how modern science can breathe life into a cold file. But beyond the forensic breakthroughs, her story is a reminder of the power of memory. In Shelby, the annual walks will likely continue even after a conviction is reached. They will walk because to stop walking would be to admit that the darkness won. They will walk because that sweetheart of Shelby belongs to everyone now. The culture of the town has been irrevocably altered, the doors are locked tighter, the gaze is a bit more vigilant, but the heart of the community has grown larger through its shared devotion to this one little girl. In the final analysis, the story of Asha Degree is not a tragedy of the woods, but a tragedy of the human heart. It is a story of what happens when we fail to protect the most vulnerable among us, and what happens when we refuse to let them be forgotten. The empathy we feel for Asha is a reflection of our own humanity, our own need to believe that justice is a real and tangible thing. As the sun sets over Highway 18, casting long, golden shadows across the asphalt where a 9-year-old girl once stood, there is a sense that the wind is finally dying down. The storm that began on Valentine's Day in 2000 is finally coming to an end. The rain has stopped, the secrets have been unearthed, and the path home is finally visible. Asha Degree was more than a missing person, she was a daughter, a sister, a teammate, and a light. That light was dimmed by a terrible act and hidden by a terrible silence, but it was never extinguished. It burned in the heart of Aquila Degree, it burned in the persistence of the FBI, and it burned in the conscience of a town that refused to look away. As we close this narrative, we do so with the knowledge that the truth is no longer a ghost. It is a solid, undeniable reality. That Sunflower of Shelby is finally turning her face toward the sun, and though the journey has been long and the cost has been unimaginable, the light is finally, beautifully, winning. Justice for Asha is no longer a question of if, but a matter of when, and in that certainty, a family, and a town, can finally begin to breathe again. The case of Asha Degree is not just a cold criminal file gathering dust, it is a wound that still bleeds in the soul of an entire community. After 25 years of searching, the truth is finally stepping out of the shadows through strands of hair, DNA samples, and haunting text messages. We cannot let her name be forgotten again. Let us share this story together so that the light of justice never fades. If you have any information, no matter how small, please have the courage to speak up. Do not let silence continue to shroud the agony of the Degree family. Justice may be delayed, but with our persistence, it must be served. Help us continue the journey of seeking truth for stolen lives by subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. Each subscription is invaluable support, ensuring that stories like Asha's are never buried. Let's keep the hope alive to bring Asha home. Thank you for standing with us, listening, and keeping the truth alive.